Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video where I go over the Prisma ORM library, and I just go over all the basics and also talk about some more advanced stuff. We're going to be building a very simple CRUD in NodeJS, and we're going to be using MySQL, but you can use any database you want. And I'll also show you guys some more advanced stuff like how to do associations, or maybe how to insert many different containers of data into a single table at the same time. And before we actually get into the video, if you guys could leave a like and subscribe if you're not subscribed, I would massively appreciate it. We're growing at a very, very rapid rate, and I couldn't be more thankful for that. But if you guys leave a like, it will push my videos to more people, and YouTube will know that you guys are liking my videos, so my channel will grow faster, and I would really appreciate if you guys could help me out with that. So now that we got that out of the way, let's start with the tutorial. Okay, so Prisma is, as you can see, it's a next generation Node.js and TypeScript ORM. And if you don't know what an ORM is just some sort of library that allows you to make database queries, SQL queries, or it doesn't need to be SQL, but in this case we're going to be using an SQL ORM, which allows you to make them without actually writing SQL. You just use simple JavaScript and the library in itself to make those queries, or to basically manipulate your database, and it makes it a lot easier. It is very powerful, and it is recommended for larger projects in my opinion. I always use an ORM. It doesn't necessarily need to be Prisma. I have videos on Sequelize and TypeORM, which are other ORMs, but Prisma, it is new. It is growing at a very fast rate. A lot of people are adapting to Prisma, and for that reason I decided to make this video. So you can see that over here we have the main website, but I actually created an application over here. Very simple. It only has a package.json, as you can see, and it has an index.ts, which will be the file where we start our application. So Prisma is mainly used for TypeScript. I'm not sure if you can use it for JavaScript, but it is probably one of the most famous TypeScript ORMs out there. So the first thing we have to do if we want to start using Prisma is we need to install the necessary packages, right? So I'm using Yarn over here in this application, but if you're using NPM, just convert the Yarn logic to the NPM logic. And the first thing we want to do is we want to say yarn add or npm install if you're using NPM. Then we want to say Prisma because we want to install the Prisma library. Then in this case we want to install TypeScript. So we're going to say TypeScript. Then obviously to configure TypeScript we have to install ts node and also some TypeScript types on node. So I'm going to say add types / node, and I'm going to say -- save dev at the end. When we press enter, it should be installing all the necessary packages, but there are some configurations that we need to make, right? So the idea is we also want to, in this case, install Express, because Express will be the library that we're going to be using to create our REST API. So we can say yarn add Express, and I also want to add the TypeScript types for Express. So I'm going to say add types / Express, like this. And we're going to install this. Very nice. Now we have Express and Prisma in our application. I'm also going to install NodeMon just so that we can run our application and we don't need to keep saving our project every time we make any changes. So I'll just install here NodeMon into our app. So now that we have that done, let's start writing all the configurations for Prisma. So right over here, we can just say something really quick. We can just come over here and say npx Prisma, and it will initialize the Prisma CLI. And then we just have to say npx Prisma init, and this will generate I believe a folder in our application called Prisma, which has a Prisma a schema.prisma file, which it's going to be essential for us, especially in the beginning, to configure and connect to our database. So in this Prisma schema.prisma file, you can see that there are two main components to it. The first one is the data source DB over here, and this is basically where you write a configuration information for your database. So we're going to be using MySQL, not Postgres, but if you're using Postgres, just put it over here. And then you can clearly see that it asks for a database URL, and it's using .env for this. So it's using env variables, environment variables, and when you run the Prisma CLI, as we just did, it creates this .env file where you can use and create env variables. And I'm just going to open this up so you guys can see everything a lot better. But the thing is, you can see that right now it gives us an example database URL, which we need to change to make it so that it will connect to our own database running in our local computer. I actually already created my database. I'm using MySQL as I mentioned, and I'm using MySQL Workbench to make this work. And I created this database called Prisma DB. It has 0 tables inside of it. And if you're using Postgres, if you're using any like SQLite, any other type of database, then don't worry, because the code will be exactly the same, but the configuration will be a little bit different because you need to create your database before this so that you can connect it, right? I'm doing everything in our root, in the root server. So basically, I'm gonna put the connection information based on that. Let's analyze this. What is this database URL, and how can we write our connection information over here so that it will work with our own database? Well, the first thing you can see is that you need to write the provider or which kind of RDBMS you're using over here. So in this case, we're using MySQL instead of Postgres, so I'll put MySQL over here. Then we have here John Doe and random password. This over here, you need to put your user name, so the user for your database connection, and here you need to put the password. So if I go over here and I go to administration in my MySQL Workbench, you don't need to do this if you don't use it. I'm using actually a connection, which is the root one. So actually, I'll close this and you guys will see. This is the connection that I'm using. It's the localhost connection, so the name is localhost. The port is 3306, and the username is root. The password, I know the password. It's actually password. That's the password that I gave. But your password is probably different. Just put this sort of information directly into the URL. So the username is root. I'm gonna put this right over here instead of John Doe. The password, in my case, is password. So I'm just gonna put password. In many cases, the password might be root, might be just an empty string. It depends on your own system. And then this should be localhost, because in my case, I'm running it on the localhost. And the port, as I showed you guys, it is 3306. So I'm going to say 3306 like this. And finally, over here, we can leave this over here done. It should be public as well, but this over here should be the actual database that you created. So in our case, I'm gonna close this over here and enter this again, and I need to put my password. I actually created this database in our app, in our schemas over here. You can see I called it Prisma DB. It doesn't have any tables yet, but this is what I called it. So I need to put Prisma DB as the database name in our project. So I'll put Prisma DB like this, and when I save this, this will automatically come and serve as the URL for our database, and the connection should be secured. If there's any issues with this, just leave a comment down below, and maybe I can help you. I'm not that experienced with Postgres and SQLite or other types of SQL databases as I am with MySQL. So if it's an issue with that, then maybe I can't help. But if it's an issue with MySQL, I can definitely help you guys out in the comments down below. So now what we have to do is we need to start building our schema. So in Prisma, you need to build your tables, and also in many other arms, you need to build your tables or your models in code without actually writing any SQL. So to actually build your models or your tables, you just come over here and you just write model and then the name of the table that you want to build. So in this example project, let's just create a users table. So I'll say user and give it this name. Then, oh, by the way, one thing that I forgot to say is the reason why I have syntax highlighting for this Prisma file is because I installed an extension called Prisma, I believe. Let me just come over here. Yeah, I installed this one. I recommend it. It will give you syntax highlighting, so it looks a lot better. So we just created this model called user, and we need to add its fields, right? So its actual columns, what we want in the table. So the first one needs to be ID, because that's a standard. It will have an ID as one of the columns. I'm gonna say that it is an int, which is an integer, and we also can give it some other properties. For example, for an ID on a table, you usually want it to be auto incrementing, right? So to do that, we'll just come over here and give it a default value, and then pass it a function called auto increment. And all of this like simple syntax, all of this different properties that you can pass are very easily and well described in the Prisma documentation, which I'm going to leave the link down below if you want to check it out. But there's many different properties you can give to each attribute that you create in your model. And then at the end, we're going to say that we want to pass and make this an ID. So right below this, we're gonna pass a different field. Let's say that our table takes in a username, which is a string, and probably our username we want it to be unique, right? We don't want two users to have the same username. So to make a field unique, you literally just pass the unique property like this. And then finally, we're going to pass the password over here, and we're going to say that it is a string. It doesn't have to be unique. People can have the same password, so let's just leave it like this. And I don't want to overcomplicate this model, but for now, let's just keep it like this, very simple. And you might be thinking, okay, but how do I translate this into an actual table? You can see that in our thing over here, it doesn't have any tables, it's empty. So to actually make it so that this will turn itself into a table in our database, and actually this will also test our connection to see if we connected successfully, we can run a command in our command line, which is going to migrate all the data that we have inside of this schema.prisma file into our actual database. So to do that, we'll just come over here and we're going to run npx prisma migrate, and then we're going to say dev for development, and then we're going to run 2 dashes name and then init. And when we run this, it's going to start running everything that is necessary for our migration to be done. And really quickly, you'll see that this will actually probably, I hope, generate all the necessary files, and also it will create our table. So let's see if it works. I'm going to refresh this database, and you can see that now we have 2 new tables in our database. One of them is called user and one is called Prisma migrations. I would ignore the Prisma migrations one. It basically just holds information about all the different migrations that you made throughout the time that you had this database. But the important one is this one over here, which is the users table. It has all the fields that we defined it to have, so that's amazing. And you can see it's very simple. You don't need to do all of this like yourself. You can just run this code and migrate it to your own database, and it will be working perfectly. Now, how do we actually make the queries? How do we deal with this database? I want to be able to add a user to the database. I want to be able to read from the table, and I want to be able to update and delete, right? I want to show you guys how to do this simple CRUD. Well, we're going to do all of this in this index.ts. So the first thing we want to do is just set up a very simple Express server. So I'm going to say import from Express, and I want to import the variable Express like this. And then down here at the bottom, we're going to say const app equal to express, and then down here at the bottom I'm going to say app.listen, and I'm just going to listen to the port 3001, and let's just pass this function, which is going to console log something like server running on port 3001. So very simple, just a simple Express server. But we're going to create 4 different endpoints for this. And I'm going to cut the video really quick. I'm going to come back and all the endpoints will be done. Okay, so as you can see over here, I created the 4 endpoints necessary for a CRUD. A post request, which is going to be used to create and add stuff to our table. The get, which reads. The put, which updates. And the delete, which deletes, right? It's just giving me some errors right now because we declared this variable rec and res and we're not using it. It's just some TypeScript error that we're going to fix later on when we start actually using those variables. But one thing that is important is you can see we're using TypeScript types. This is just a preference. You don't really need to do this, but since we're using TypeScript, I'm just going to put them right over here. So now to actually use Prisma in our app, we need to import the Prisma client. So I'm going to come here at the top and I'm going to say import from the library at Prisma client, and then we're going to import the actual variable called Prisma client. It is a class, as you can see, and we're going to be using it to manipulate all the different tables that we have in our application. I also want to come over here and say that I want to use express.json because in this case specifically, we want to be able to parse all the JSON that comes to our application, and we need to do this or else we're not going to be able to use JSON. Then we need to create an instance of this Prisma client, so we'll just say const Prisma, or you can call it whatever you want, equals to new Prisma client, like this. And we're going to create an instance of this class. And now we can use this variable to manipulate the table, which is really nice. So the first thing we want to do is we want to be able to use this Prisma instance over here to add some sort of user to our user table. So inside of the post request over here, we're going to first of all get the data that you want to add to your table, which is going to be sent through some JSON. So to do that, we're just going to say const equal to rec.body, because we're going to grab that from the body. And we're going to grab the username and the password of the new user. So username and password, right? And now with Prisma, there's a function you can run which will allow you to automatically add everything without actually running any SQL. This function is called the create function. So all we have to do is we're going to create this variable called user, which is going to represent the user that we're trying to create. And we're going to say equals to await. So we have to make this asynchronous. And whenever you're using Prisma, it is advised to always make your functions asynchronous. And we're going to say await, and then we're going to say Prisma dot the name of the table you want to manipulate, so user, and then we're going to say dot create, like this. And we're going to pass the object inside of here, which will contain the data in which we want to create, right? So I'm going to create, we're going to pass the username, and the username will be equal to username, and we're going to pass a password, which is going to be equal to password. So when we save this, you can see that it's actually working. One thing that is important as well is you need to import over here at the top the request and the response classes, or else TypeScript will keep giving you errors. But basically, all we have to do is this right here, because this will automatically know that we're trying to insert this data into our user table. And at the end, I'm just going to return as JSON the user that we tried to create. And this is basically it for creating a user. Now, if you want to read or basically create an endpoint that is going to get all items from the table, it's a lot easier. You just come over here to your endpoint. So in this case, it's just a simple get. And we're going to create a variable called users. So users or user list, whatever you want. And we're going to say await. And then we're going to say Prisma.user.findMany. So findMany, it is a function which allows you to get many different rows from a table. And in this case, when we don't pass any conditions or anything like that, it automatically gets everything and returns everything inside of this user table. So at the end, let's just return back the users variable that we received, and this should return all the items in the table. It's a lot easier than writing an SQL statement without, like, just writing SQL without using any ORM, as you can see. So with the put request, we can do a lot of other things. We want to be able to update some sort of piece of data in our table. So in our case, I want to update the username, right? Imagine that you want to be able to update the username from a user. So to actually do that, we need two pieces of information. We need an identifier for which user we want to update, and we want the new value that we want to pass, right? So if we want to update the username, we need to grab from the body an ID and a username, or the new username. So I'm gonna say const equals to rect.body. And then we're going to grab an ID, the ID of the user that we want to update, and its new username. So over here, we can create a variable called updated user. So we're going to receive back the user with its new values. And then we're going to set it equal to await Prisma.user. And we're going to call the function update. And update will update some field in your table. So how we actually structure this is we need to pass two objects inside of here. We need to pass a where object, which contains like which field we want to use as an identifier. So in this case, we want to say where we want to update a user where the ID of the user is equal to the ID that we passed in our body. And then we need to pass a data, which will be the new, like the change that we want to make. So I want to change the username to be equal to the new username. And this is kind of the structure of an update. It's kind of weird, but it makes sense, right? We're just passing the identifier and the data that we want to change. And this is basically it for the update request. So I'm just gonna return back the updated user like this. And then finally, for the delete, we're going to actually use params. As you can see over here, we're going to grab the ID from the params, and we are also going to make this async. And inside of here, to delete a user from your table, it's as simple as the get request that we make. We just come over here, and we need to first grab the ID that we're passing through the params. So I'm going to say const ID equals to rect.params.id, like this. And then all we have to do is create again a variable that is going to represent the user that we're trying to delete. So deleted user. And we're going to set this equal to await. And we're going to call Prisma.user, because it's the user table, .delete, right? And inside of here, we just have to pass an identifier. So when I say an identifier, I mean you got to pass a where and some sort of field that we want to use as the identifier. So in this case, we're going to say we want to delete the user where the ID is equal to the ID that we grabbed from the params. And as always, at the end, we're going to res.json the deleted user. So this is it for our actual CRUD. You can see that we're getting a red line over here, and the reason for that is because when you pass variables in their params, it actually grabs it back as a string. So, and we declare that ID is not a string; it's an integer. So, just a side note, if you have this problem, just convert the ID to a number. Because you're gonna get errors with that. Prisma is really good with TypeScript. It alerts you of every single error that you might be making. So this is one of the great things from this library. So you can see that this should be working, and we're actually gonna test if our API is working, if we're actually adding stuff to our table, if we're actually deleting them, if we're updating them, or if we're able to actually read them. The way we're gonna do this is I'm gonna use this really cool API tester that I use all the time called Insomnia. You can download it down below. It is a replacement for Postman. I know a lot of people use Postman, but basically you can see I made here all the 4 requests that we're going to be making: the get all users, the create user, the update username, and the delete user. And all of them are making the request to the localhost 3001, which is the port that we told our application to run at. So one thing I want to do is I want to come to our package.json before we run, and I want to be using node-mon, right? Because I mentioned that I want to run with node-mon. So to make node-mon run is we just have to come over here and pass the scripts tag. And inside of here, I'm going to pass a script. Let's call it dev start, which means that we want to start our development environment. And we're just going to say that it will basically run nodemon index.ts, which is the file that we are starting our application. And now that we have this done, let's run our API. To run our API, I'll just say again yarn dev start, and it should start running, as you can see. Now, it says server running on port 3001, and we know that in our table we have no items, right? We have no user created here. Now, let's try creating a user. In Insomnia, all you have to do is you have to put the type of your request, so a post request, the endpoint, and then pass some sort of JSON if you want to. I set this as JSON because that's what we're passing. And I'm trying to create a username a user over here with the username PedroTech and the password secret password. So to make this work, let's just click send, and you can see that it returned okay. It said it was successful. Let's test to see if this actually worked. If I query our table, now we have a user called PedroTech, and it has the secret password as a password, right? So it means it's working. Let's see if our get request or our query is working. You can see it is. It returns all the users in the table. Let's see if our update username is working. Over here, you pass an ID and a username. So the username over here you pass is what you want to change it to. Right now, it is PedroTech. Let's change it to Pedro, right? Let's see if it works. If I click this, it said it was successful. And if we try to get this again, now it's Pedro and not PedroTech. And let's try to delete the user. To delete user, you just have to make a delete request and pass the ID of the user you want to delete. So Pedro, like PedroTech or Pedro, has an ID of 1. So we'll pass 1 over here at the top as the params. And when we click send, it should have deleted. So now if I try to run this again, it returns an empty array because there's nothing in our table, as you can see over here. So all of our requests have worked so far, which is amazing, and I hope you guys are getting value from this because Prisma is amazing. It is a lot more powerful than this basic CRUD. Now I want to show you guys another example, which is basically being able to get a user by ID. So to do that, we're going to create a get request over here really quick, another get request. But now we're going to call this endpoint or this route by ID to identify that this is we're trying to get some user by its ID. So to do this, we're going to need it to pass some sort of param. So we're going to say that you need to pass the ID as a parameter. So over here, we're going to grab this ID from the parameters. So const ID equals to rec.params.id, like this. And with this, we can now come over here, and instead of saying find many, you can guess that we can actually use a function called find unique, which inside of here we can pass some sort of identifier that will only return one single user with that identifier. So the identifier we want to use here is obviously the ID. So I'm going to say where ID is equal to ID. So now this should return a single user. So I'm going to call this user, and it has to be with the ID that we mentioned. And again, we need to convert this to number because it was a string, but we defined ID to be a number or an integer. So this should be working. If we come to our Insomnia, let's create a new request over here. It should be get by ID, and it's a get request. And I'm just going to copy the endpoint like this, paste it over here, and call it by ID. And then let's try to get a new user, right? Right now, we don't have any users in our table. Let's create PedroTech again. Its ID will be number 2, but let's create another user. I'm going to call it Michael Scott. So the password will be Scott. And let's click send. And let's get all the users in our table just so we see we have 2 users in our table. And let's get Michael. So to get Michael, we just put the ID of Michael. So it's 3. And you can see that it returns Michael. If I want to get Pedro, I'll put 2 and it returns PedroTech, which is amazing. Now that we went over the basics, I want to go over some of the more advanced stuff, like how do you add many different like users at the same time, or maybe how can I update many users at the same time, or even how do I create association between different models. So for example, if we want to be able to create many different users at the same time, one thing that we can do is let's actually create here a post request, another post request, and call it something like create many users. I hate this name, but like you guys get what I mean, right? Over here, we want to take into account not one username or not like one password. We're actually going to take in as part of our body a list of objects, and each object should contain a username and a password. So we're just adding, instead of just one, we're adding a list of users, right? So to grab that, we're going to call the list something like user list, like this. And when we say create, instead of saying create, we'll say actually create many. And it knows that automatically it should be accepting over here as part of the data a list. So we can say user list over here, and at the end let's just return the users. I'll call it users and just return it like this. Now if we come here to Insomnia and we're going to create a new request, it's going to be a post request. Let's call it create many users, and it's going to be a post request, right? And the body will be a JSON, like this. So over here we're just going to put the same endpoint as the other post request, but it should be create many users because that's what we called it, right? And in the JSON, instead of passing an object like this, we're going to pass a list of objects, and each object will be in the format of a username and a password. So this is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to pass an object like this. Let's create 3 of them, right? So you can see this is the format, a list of users. And the first one will be, let's call it James. The password is 123. Second one is whatever. Actually, I don't care. I'm going to put the password whatever as well. This one I'm going to call it Leo, and I'm going to put the password 789. Something like this, right? We're also going to have to make all of this into a single object, like this. And the reason for that is because you still need to pass an object with a property, and the property will be called user list, and the user list will be an array. So actually I need to make this like this, and the formatting is kind of weird, but when we click send, you'll see that it gives us a count of 3, which means we actually added 3 users at the same time. And when we come to get all users, we now should have all the users, including the ones that we just added. So now we're getting into the last part and last section of this video. We're going to teach you guys how to actually work with associations and creating different models and interconnecting them together. So in this case, let's create a very simple example, and let's actually create let's think about it this way. We have a table called users, and imagine that each user for some reason has a car, right? So each user can have multiple cars, and we're going to create here a table for cars. Let's call it car, and we want to be able to associate a car with a user, right? So each car must be owned by a user, and we can have multiple cars who are owned by the same user. So we're going to be interconnecting them by putting fields in between them, so that when we want to query the users and we want to know all the cars that exist that are from that user, we can make that kind of relationship very easily. So with Prisma, this is pretty simple. Honestly, it's very simple. All you have to do is, I'm actually going to create the car model up here. For no reason, I just prefer to have I prefer to have the user model right at the bottom. You guys don't need to do this. But for a car, we want to have an ID, obviously, similar to this over here. I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it over here. And then we're going to have let's think about it this way. What do we want for a car? The model, right, is just a string. So we know which model it is. Maybe the year in which it was produced, so that's an integer. It can also be a datetime. I'm not going to focus on all the different types of like fields that you can add in Prisma. You can check that out in the documentation. But the important thing is we're going to associate a user to this car. So we're going to pass over here a user field, and we're going to say that it is of type user. And we're going to put a question mark and we're going to say that it has a relation to the following fields. In this case, we're going to create over here right at the bottom. We're going to we actually want to create a field in each car, which is the user ID. And this basically is a field representing the ID of the user who owns this car. So we're going to pass an int, and we're going to say that the field that relates it's this user ID to the ID or the field, which is the reference, right? So we're going to pass references over here, and we're going to say ID. So this is kind of the idea, right? You're just passing, you're creating a field called user, and you're just saying that it relates to the user model over here, and we're trying to pass this field as the field that we want to relate to, and this as the reference. So to actually make this connection, we also have to say that each user needs to have a car or multiple cars. So in this case, we want to allow each user to have multiple cars. So we're going to say that it might have a field called cars, and it's going to be an array of cars. So we just pass this empty brackets over here. So this means that now we have a connection between both of them. We have a table called user, we have a table called car. The car has an ID, a model, a year, and also the user in which it relates to, and the ID of that user. And each user will have a username and a password and a list of all the cars that they own. And each car will include all the information that exists in the car table. So this is kind of cool, right? So to actually make this changes occur, because you can see that in our table over here, this car table isn't even here because we actually need to run the migration again. And the migration, I'm going to cancel our code that is running right now. If you recall, you need to run this code over here, npx prisma migrate -- name init. When I press this, it's going to run everything, and it's going to generate a new migration to our table. And when we refresh this over here, you'll see that now we have a car table. We also have another migration entry in our migration table, and the car table is pretty interesting. You can see that it has an ID, a model, a year, and the user ID. And now if we go to the user table, you'll see that if we want to query all the users, or all the, like, if we want to grab, for example, over here in our index.ts, right? Let me come over here. If we want to grab all the users that exist, and together with the list of users that we have, we want to query the cars that they have as well, it's actually pretty simple. All we have to do is we need to add some cars to this table over here, and I'm going to do that pretty simple. I'm actually going to just create an endpoint over here, which is going to be a create car endpoint. I'm going to create it right over here. I'm just going to copy the code that we created. I'm going to create a CreateMany endpoint, which is so we can create many different cars at the same time. Let's call it CreateMany cars. And we're going to use the car table now instead of the user table. And let's grab a car list, and let's just pass it as a data. And this will be cars, and we're just going to return them back. Now that we have this endpoint, we can actually run it in Insomnia. I'm just going to create I'm actually going to duplicate this one over here and call it CreateMany cars. And instead of being CreateMany users, we're going to say CreateMany cars. and instead of passing, oh, I accidentally passed the correct information. Let me just run this again, and let's come over here to Insomnia. Now, instead of passing a user list, we need to pass a car list like this, right? Because we called it a car list. We said that this is what we want to pass in our body, and we want to pass for each car. We need to pass a model, a year, and a user ID. So let's just pass a model over here. Let's call it a Tesla. I know that that's a brand, not a model, but I don't care. And then the year, let's pass 291, whatever. And the user ID, let's say that PedroTech owns this Tesla. So let's say the ID will be 1, right? Because PedroTech is 1, I guess. Let me just check to see if it's... No, it's actually 2. But so let's actually change that. Let's make it 2. And then we want to add another car. So I'm going to copy all of this. Let's make this also for PedroTech. And let me make this a Ferrari. And the year was 2931. It's also from Pedro. And the final one is not a... It's a... I don't know. Let's make it a Honda. It's from 1987. And it is for Michael Scott, which is user number 3. So let's pass it over here. When we click send, it should create all the users. Actually, I got an error because we passed the year as a string, but it should be a number. And I completely forgot this. So let me just remove these things over here. And it should now be a number. And let me run my code again. So we're running our server again. And you can see that if I click send now, it actually counted 3. So it means it should be, like, our table should be updated. If I refresh our car list, it now has 3 cars. Beautiful. So now if we want to query all users and include the cars that each user have, we actually need to come to our request. So over here you can see CreateMany, and we can pass a property inside of this, which is the include property, and we need to pass the name of the field that we added. So the field that we added in the user is cars, so we need to say that we want to include cars, and they need to be true. So we're saying that including cars is equal to true, which means that whenever we query all the users, we also want to include the cars that each user has. So when we come to Insomnia and we make this request again, it now includes for the users who has cars, the individual cars that they have. So for example, PedroTech has 2 cars, Michael Scott has 1, but all the other ones don't have one, so it doesn't include. So this is a very brief overview of associations and relations using Prisma, but you can see it's very easy. It is very self-explanatory, straightforward, which it's a bit different from other libraries. I know doing it in Typeform is a bit harder. SQLize, it's pretty similar to Prisma, but overall, I love my experience with Prisma. I am a big fan of Typeform for TypeScript and SQLize for just JavaScript in general, but maybe in my next projects I'll probably be using Prisma just because it's a new technology and I really like how it looks. I really like the flow of a project when using Prisma, and I've been using Typeform for a long time, so maybe it's time for a change. So that's kind of my opinion on the library. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting 3 times a week and it's been a lot of work, but I love the support that I get from you guys. So if you guys can leave a like, help push my video to more people, I would really appreciate that. And yeah, that's basically it. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.